What are fairy tales? If I ask you if you know what fairy tales are, you would probably say yes, of course. If I pressed and asked you, so what are they? Many of you would say those are stories like Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Snow White, Hansel and Gretel, Beauty and the Beast, Jack and the Beanstalk, the Fisherman and His Wife, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. That's not a definition or an explanation. Rather, it is a list of examples. A list of examples is a great place to start because we may ask what all of these or most of these have in common that make them all fairy tales. But it's still not an explanation. So pause the video and think about 2 or 3 fairy tales that you know well. Ask yourselves, what do they have in common? One defining feature of fairy tales is that they include magical, supernatural, impossible occurrences and creatures. Witches, magic mirrors, magic lamps, magic beans, giant talking fish who grant wishes, genies who grant wishes, talking wolves who can look like your grandmother, houses made of candy or houses walking on chicken legs, and some more witches. In fairy tales, magic is real, and in addition, characters are rarely surprised by magic, just a fact of the world of the fairy tales. Fairy tales do not always have fairies. Cinderella, I think, is the only very famous fairy tale that actually includes a fairy, but they almost always have some kind of magical or impossible occurrence. Fairy tales are usually not set in a specific historical period or a country that actually exists. The famous opening of Once Upon a Time in a Kingdom Far, Far Away places them in the land of imagination and not as events that could really happen. Some fairy tales are just assumed to take place in the country where they are told, but rarely do we have a concrete place name. This is in contrast to legends like King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table or Robin Hood that deal with characters who may have actually lived in history, and these legends are also located in a specific place, like England, in a certain moment in history. Robin Hood, for instance, happens during the Crusades. You can say that about Little Red Riding Hood. You can say Little Red Riding Hood takes place during the Crusades. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is somewhere between legend and fairy tale because Hamelin is a real place in Germany, and many people who were telling this story in Hamelin really believe that it happened. In contrast, nobody will be able to tell you where Granny's cabin is located. Another feature that a lot of these fairy tales have in common is that they end happily. They have happy endings. Sometimes we even call happy endings fairy tale endings. The good characters find that what they want, while the bad ones are punished. Cinderella escapes her horrible stepmother and marries a prince. Hansel and Gretel kill the witch. Ali Baba gets away with the thief's gold. Some endings are not happy for the main characters, but have a feeling that the characters get what they deserve. In The Fisherman and His Wife, the couple end sad in their old shack with nothing to show for all their wishes. So it's difficult to say it's a happy ending, but it's only a happy ending in the sense that they get what they deserve for asking for more and more things. For asking too much, they get nothing. So they get what they deserve, it feels like. Finally, there's the protagonist, main character in fairy tales. These have common features. Often the main character is a child or a young person. They are more or less ordinary people. They don't have special qualities. They don't have special powers. Even when they are princesses or princes, they don't have unique personalities or unique abilities. Maybe they are a little cleverer than other people, but not always. Often they just seem more lucky than other people. Think of Cinderella. She's mostly just lucky for having a fairy godmother who helps her. Or think about the fairy tale of the Puss in the Boots, where the young boy is just lucky that a talking cat decides to help him. The young boy himself doesn't really do anything, just listens to the cat. Sometimes they are depicted as especially good or especially kind, helping old women, old men, animals, but those are qualities that are possible to imitate. Anyone listening to the fairy tale could aspire, could want to be as kind as the main character. You could argue that the fact that they are quite ordinary and often young makes it easy for the listeners to empathize and sympathize with them. The main characters in fairy tales are often very sympathetic. I will mention that these heroes and heroines sometimes depicted as very beautiful. That's the one quality that seems to be extraordinary about them. It's the only legitimate uniqueness that they are allowed. Now that we have four defining features: magic, imaginary lands and times, simple protagonists, and happy endings, these features that exist in most fairy tales, let's ask where fairy tales come from. Who created them? Fairy tales are one of the oldest forms of literature. They probably existed before writing was even invented. Most of the fairy tales we know are part of the oral tradition or folk tradition. That means that they were told by people who might not necessarily be able to read and write. They were told and then repeated by those who heard them and then repeated again and again. Thus, by word of mouth, they spread geographically and from generation to generation. Every telling is a little different, but together, all these tellings together created the fairy tales as we know them. Today, our society is more literate than in the past, more literate than ever, and we know a lot of the fairy tales only through reading them in books. However, it's good to remember that their original context is being told to children and adults alike by the fire or while doing household chores. Indeed, there's evidence that many of those telling the stories were women. Sometimes another word for fairy tale is old wives' tales, which is a term people don't usually use anymore, but it's evidence that it was associated with women. Throughout much of history, men dominated written literature, but women still had a say in the folk tradition. Understanding the context of the telling of these fairy tales can explain why there are so many versions for each fairy tale. Each person telling the story remembers it a little different, changes it to fit their intended audience or their own preferences, changing it according to the situation of telling the story. Because we don't know who the original author was, people feel free to change the details around. Thus, Cinderella can be called Aschenputtel in Germany or Lichluchit in Israel. In some versions, she has a gold slipper, in some a glass slipper. In some versions, she has one sister, in some two. It is important to know that there's nothing like the original version of the tale. There is no original Cinderella. There's no original Little Red Riding Hood. All we can aspire to is to find the oldest version we know. The first version was lost to history because it was only spoken out loud and never recorded in writing. Folklorists, academics who study the folk tradition, including fairy tales, recognize that fairy tales tend to fall into tale types. These are basic plot structures that exist in many different, often faraway cultures. Thus, there's a story type of a girl made to marry some monster, but through her love, he returns to human form. This is the story of Beauty and the Beast, but in other cultures, it might be a monster, a fox, or a snake, or just a man who may not be seen at all and only comes in the dark. It's the same tale type, but with different details. Sometimes the details can be very significant. For instance, if the female heroine is presented as passive and only waiting to be rescued, or if she's presented as acting for herself. But the tale type remains the same unless the plot is very different. Our unit will include a number of versions of Little Red Riding Hood. As I said, fairy tales are part of the oral tradition. Despite our society being more literate than ever, I think that even today people do tell fairy tales from memory and adapt them for each time they tell them according to their memory, continuing this tradition of telling stories from memory. For instance, when my son was 3 or 4, he demanded that I tell him stories off the top of my head, not read him stories. He also really loved dinosaurs, so I would retell fairy tales that I remembered, and the best I could recall them. But all the characters would be dinosaurs. Some of the important features of fairy tales can be explained by their lives in the oral tradition. For instance, they have stark contradictions between good and evil because those are easier to remember and explain in the setting of the telling of a story and not just reading it from the paper where you can slow down or read back. This is all speaking, so it has to be sometimes a little simpler. Fairy tales often feature the number 3. 3 sons, 3 attempts to do something, because that is a scale manageable for the telling of stories. We have 2 that set a pattern, right? 2 people fail to do something. 2 brothers are big and strong and mean, and the third one is nice. So we have 2 examples to set a pattern, and one that's the exception, and that's the main thing about the story. It is a pattern that's easy to retell and simple to understand. So the origin of fairy tales and even their lives today are word of mouth. But today, a lot of the fairy tales are known to us from written sources. Now, this is also a very long tradition. We have tales like these in written collections from more than 1,000 years ago, with the most famous examples being the Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights. We have fairy tales, we have fairy tale-like stories in Chaucer, if you recall him from your studies in English literature. Until the 19th century, the Romantic period, these retellings of fairy tales in writing were in a very literary style, and they did not try to imitate the style of people just telling stories from memory. This changed in the 19th century with scholars and writers wanting to record in writing, and later on when those technologies were invented in audio and video, how people actually tell these stories. The most famous example of such a project of collecting how people tell stories and not just the plot of the stories is the collection project that ended up as household and children's tales by the brothers Grimm. So Jacob and Wilhelm traveled in different areas of what is now Germany and asked people, mostly women, to tell them stories, to tell them tales. They adapted them to and combined them but they did so to a much lesser degree than in the past and tried to record what those stories sounded like and what their style was when people were actually telling them by the fireside or while working. Since the Grimm project, there have been many projects like that of collecting folklore, collecting folk stories, including fairy tales. A short, not so academic version of their collection became very popular in different languages, and their versions are still the standard version for a lot of the fairy tales, the famous fairy tales that we know today. So to sum up this video, fairy tales are stories based on oral tradition, spreading by word of mouth and memory. Because they were created in this way, fairy tales have many versions, similar in plot structure but differing greatly in detail. They almost always have magical supernatural elements and are set in a faraway, non-historical setting. They usually have a young protagonist without unique qualities. They also tend to have happy endings.